Hello, my name is John Canning. I'm one of the project advisors on the Speak project. I'm joined here by Professor Bella Millet, who is Professor of Medieval Literature here at the University of Southampton. And Bella has recently won an award from the Student Union here in Southampton for the best feedback in a whole university. So congratulations, Bella, on your award. We often find on things like the National Student Survey, for example, in other surveys of students, that feedback is a particularly difficult area, and perhaps one where the students experience the lowest levels of satisfaction. Why do you think that might be the case?
Oh, well, there are various reasons, I think. I'll concentrate on three. There was a recent survey, 2013 student satisfaction survey, which was run jointly by Which Magazine and HEPI, the Higher Education Policy Institute. And what they said on feedback was very interesting. The first thing that students complained about with feedback is that it wasn't fast enough, that students sometimes had to wait months rather than weeks for their work. They didn't get comments on the first bit of work before they were starting on the second piece of work, things like that. Right. Second, they thought that the feedback wasn't adequate. They might get just a grade. They might get cursory comments, nothing very constructive, nothing which could really help them to move forward. And they felt sometimes that their tutors weren't very interested in giving them a chance for further discussion of their work. So that's two reasons, speed and fullness. But there is a third one that I've noticed, and this one comes out of our own questionnaires. Now, obviously, as in all universities, class sizes over the past few years have been going up, marking loads have increased. And we have been experimenting with other forms of assessment, other forms of feedback. So, for example, if you're giving people exercises, you go for generic feedback rather than individual feedback. You might put up online exercises with answers. You might encourage the students to produce peer-reviewed blogs rather than essays. And it's very interesting what the responses were. Obviously, all of these things have got a pedagogic point that can be very useful. But when the students felt that they were being used not as a supplement to the more traditional methods, but as a substitute, they got very upset. They really resented it. They felt that the direct individual contact between tutor and student was really the essential part of assessment. And I think it's important that we also bear that in mind as we look around for other ways of assessing people.
So in some ways the innovations may have actually sort of been detrimental to student satisfaction experience with feedback.
Yes, I would say that sometimes they have. Not always, it depends how they're used. I mean, one academic response is, look, the students don't realise what feedback really is. They need to be more independent. They shouldn't be depending on us the whole time. But I feel that that kind of guidance is quite important, that it's a huge jump from school to university. Suddenly you have acres of free time if you're a student. Your first essay isn't due until week 7. All you have to do is hang around with charming new friends. It's very difficult to adjust to this. Sometimes well into their second year, students have not made this adjustment. That independence needs guidance like everything else. If you want to teach your baby to swim, you don't chuck it into the deep end at the swimming pool. You get into the swimming pool and you help it. That intellectual growth, intellectual independence is a long process. And it really means that students need to be pushed, they need to be challenged. If you just leave them alone to get on with their own assessment, they may not grow. They won't flourish. They'll stay alive, but they won't flourish.
Yeah, that's interesting. And on a practical level, I mean, when your students arrive in their first year, for example, I mean, what do you do on a practical level to help them become independent?
Ah, good question. In the first year, it's less important, I think, because the module I teach is essentially a training module. So I run it largely on exercises and exams. I encourage them to put in the hours, to manage their time, to learn things by heart. They will be having fewer contact hours than they're used to. They'll have to spend a lot of time working on their own, and I will encourage them to do that. But really, I would expect them to take off in their second or final years.
And do you feel that your first year module sort of prepares them for that? That's what you're working towards with these sort of skills type modules there?
It prepares them with certain types of skills. There are other more free-form modules which train them in other things. What I'm offering them in my first year module is a language module, basically. I teach them Anglo-Saxon. And what I'm teaching them is discipline, time management, keeping things in your head rather than assuming that you can get everything off the web. So that's what I teach them. It is a particular aspect of independence, because discipline is actually part of independence.
So did you feel that you integrate these skills into your teaching of Anglo-Saxon, or is this something that you sort of put in along the way while you're teaching Anglo-Saxon?
I teach them through Anglo-Saxon, I would say.
Right.
Because a lot of these are generic skills, or skills which are generic to the learning of languages, of course.
Yes.
You know, if you're on a Greek beach and you want to chat somebody up, then you're not going to be able to look up every word in the dictionary. It needs to be in your head.
Yes. And the students, then I suppose they become better prepared for, you know, taking your higher level second and third year modules and that sort of thing.
Yes, but I wouldn't say that the rest of the first year should be taught on those lines.
No.
This is a very specific type of teaching to give the students a particular kind of skill.
So this isn't, this is something that fits in the curriculum as a whole, within the whole department. This isn't just about your teaching, but it's something that sort of fits, hopefully, into the broader experience of the English degree for everybody, even if, you know, this doesn't become their speciality.
Yes, because I believe that every English student should have an experience of language. They should realise that different languages reflect different cultures, see reality in different ways. And they move on from the basic language skills to reading Old English poetry in the original, and realising that while we use what may historically be the same words for certain things, those words mean something completely different in their cultural context. In fact, the module's called Language, Text and Culture. So there are broader issues raised, as well as these narrow skills of finding out what a noun and an adjective and a preposition are.
Right, so this covers quite a substantial amount of ground in so many different
It does.
aspects. Do you think that these are the sorts then of the sorts of modules that need to be sort of more widespread throughout the university? What do you think you could bring to others, in other departments or disciplines?
That is hard to say. What I teach is, in my first year modules, is something which would apply to language modules, of course, across the university. What I teach in my second year or later modules is much more transferable. A lot of it, of course, has to do with writing skills,
Right.
which everybody needs. Skills of argument, how you structure an argument, how you reason. Can you build a solid argument? If it were a bridge, would it fall down? I'm an engineer's daughter. I mind about these things.
Yes.
So I would say the further on the students go, the more generic the skills that you teach them.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Interesting thought. What do you think the university as a whole, at the sort of senior level, could do about making feedback better for students? Obviously you're doing really good work in your own classroom, but how can you encourage others, both within your department indeed, and as a matter of sort of wider university policy, to improve the way things are done?
Well, my colleagues in my department are already working very hard on this, and I actually wouldn't presume to tell them what to do. I do have a wish list, though, for senior management. At the top of it, and I'm sure it's at the top of every academic's wish list, is more resourcing for staffing and for office space. That if your classes are too large, then you're going to find it difficult to to mark essays to a good standard and on time. You're going to find it difficult to get to know your students, and you're going to find it difficult to clear the time to talk to them. As for office space, there's a national pressure, not just university, to get academics into shared offices. The problem with this, it makes it awfully hard to timetable one-to-one sessions with students.
Yes.
And whether they're confidential or not, one sometimes needs those one-to-one sessions. I make a lot of use of them. And I really would like the university to take this on board in its planning, that we need that individual contact between students and staff. At the moment it's very, very difficult to arrange. Anyway, that is in an ideal world. Yes. But I should point out, I think, that in the 2013 Times Higher Education Student Experience Survey, the university, which ended up at the top, had invested quite heavily in improving its staff-student ratio from 1 to 18 to 1 to 13.5.
Right.
And that made a very big difference to its ranking. So it is worth considering, because I know that the university is concerned about its place in league tables. Right, that's in an ideal world. In the real world, if we're working on our present resources, then what we really need is very efficient administrative systems, information systems to support us. The first thing that I would like is a fully functional e-assignment system, so that we can get work back to our students fast and efficiently. Now, we do actually have an e-assignment system, and I think it's a very good thing. I think it's made a big difference already to our assessment, but it isn't yet fully functional. It is not communicating with other university information systems, and I'd really like the university to make that kind of integration a priority. Now, the second thing that I would like is really good student information systems. And what we need here, really as a matter of urgency, is a student dashboard, by which I mean a simple online system, user-friendly, which you can go to and you can find out all the information that you need very quickly about a particular student. What do they look like? There's a mugshot. Contact details, the name of the academic advisor, what modules are they doing, what's their run of marks like. Now, at present we don't have a university-wide system for doing this. We do actually have a system. It's called eFolio, and it's been used in parts of the university since 2009. And a colleague of mine discovered it a couple of months ago.
Oh, right.
And I have been using it for the past couple of months, and it has transformed my relationship with my students and my feedback. It is fantastic. You can really put your students in context, and you can do it quickly and efficiently. And what I would really like, at the moment it isn't resourced for university-wide use, but what I would really like to see is the university putting its full weight behind it.
So when you come to an individual student, you don't know just about their performance and about on your own course, but you can see it in a broader context.
God, yes.
Therefore you can identify any potential problems they may have, or you can identify particularly good students, or indeed see what areas they need to improve in Generally, yeah.
That's where it makes a difference. Let me give you an example. Suppose a student, you're looking at, with my second year students, I'm looking at a year and a half's run of marks, of completed marks. So I look at a student's record. In the first year, they've been getting 60s and 70s.
Right, okay.
Great, this is obviously an intelligent student. Look at the second year, and their mark range is high 40s to low 50s.
Oh, right. Mm.
And the first thing you think is, right, my mark for them is consistent with their marks for this year, but something has gone very wrong here.
Right.
And you have to raise that. If you just give it back to the student, here's another not very good essay, then that is not good feedback. You have to find out what the problem is.
So often these, you know, part of your role in feedback is not just the academic side, but things that might be going on now, you know, which may have affected their performance, things outside their academic lives.
Yes, a lot of students actually, these days, nationally as well as locally, are under a lot of stress. Some of them have illnesses, some of them have difficult domestic circumstances, some of them have financial problems. We need a good system for getting disability notices
Right.
to us for a start, so we can make sure that we take that into account. But one of the things that I do when I'm giving feedback to my students is I try to check that bigger picture. I mean, my feeling is, as you say, you can't separate that kind of thing from the teaching. And I am not sure whether the academic advisor system really works. I think it might have had its day. I think we need to integrate that system more closely with our teaching, and basically that's what I do with my students. Because I give all of them an individual interview in the second part of the semester. They bring their work, the work that they've done already. It might be an essay, it might be a set of exercises. We discuss that work. First years get 20 minutes, second years get 30 minutes, and that gives me enough time to look at them, look at the whole person, and not just their work.
Right.
And that's what really helps us to move forwards.
So you feel over the course of time you get to know your students very well. Or some of them, I'm sure, better than others. But
well, really, one ought to know all one's students. You know, every tutor has a problem with the three girls at the back with brown hair called Emma who you can't tell apart. But since I've been using eFolio, where you get student photos and you can check them very fast, I've actually really been learning my students' names. And I think if you showed me all the student photos from the last module I taught, I would be able to identify them.
Right.
And that is the ideal. This is what a tutor should do. I mean, it's the least you owe to your students to remember their names.
Well, yes, yes. So that's an example where technological, you know, we've got this increase in number of students that we've talked about before, so it's perhaps more difficult than it was traditionally, but this is a resource that enables you to get to know your students a bit better, know what they look like, and be, you know, provide that context. So do you think that's, you know, I mean, do you feel that's something that's generally lacking in feedback? Generally, that it's very isolated and related to a particular assignment, I suppose, or a particular module, and without any other context. Is that?
Yes, I do feel that. I mean, today the Guardian league tables, university league tables, came out. Top of the range is Cambridge. Well, maybe no big surprises there. Next is Oxford. But the Guardian actually singled out for comment the very high ratings that Cambridge students gave for assessment and feedback.
Right.
The very high degree of contact between teacher and student. I mean, obviously it's easier at Cambridge, it's a very rich university. But even so, I think that what they're saying should not be ignored.
No, so we really need, there needs to be that investment in, in staff. But also you mentioned, about shared offices and the sort of architectural side, I suppose, of feedback, which is maybe something I hadn't really thought about. I mean, if you were able to design with the constraints and number of staff, we have and budgets. I mean, what would be the most efficient way of designing a building, do you think?
This is
your
very
vision?
difficult. There's a big row going on in the Times Higher Education magazine at the moment, because the Vice-Chancellor has written in and said, look, we don't want all these corridors with rows of closed doors. What we want is a nice, active, shared office for everybody. And there have been a lot of furious correspondents writing in and saying, look, we need space to think quietly, we need time to prepare our stuff, we need time to talk to students. But of course, offices are very expensive and people use them in different ways. One possible suggestion which has been raised, it's a Scandinavian solution where you do have big communal areas, but you also have cubby holes for individual staff,
Right.
where they can keep their books, where they can see their students, where they can get quiet time.
Right.
And you do not want to eliminate solitary space. Even sharing an office with 1 or 2 people can really be very difficult when it comes to privacy. And most academics are introverts. They flourish more when they have a quiet space of their own. So I don't want to run down open plan offices. I mean, I know an administrator who is a fantastic administrator in humanities, and he says that, you know, an office with a door would be his idea of hell. And I can understand what he means, because he's someone who manages by walking about and is very good. But most academics, they do need that private space, and they need it for their students as well as themselves.
Right, well, that's interesting, and I noticed you share an office yourself. You have
Yes.
I don't know whether we can pan around on the camera a bit, Lawrence, but there's a bookcase separates you from your colleague, which is
Colleagues.
colleagues who are the other side, who are the other side of the bookcase. So yeah, I mean, did you find you have to schedule? I mean, is this private enough, this sort of environment, or do you have to make sure that other people aren't in when you?
I have to make sure that other people aren't in. Fortunately, these 2 colleagues aren't in a lot because they're on part-time arrangements of various kinds. But even 2 full-time academics sharing an office, it's very, very difficult for them.
Yes.
I mean, it has to be done, but and I can see the problems. But if the university is planning forward, it needs to plan for some kind of private space. And not just for the comfort of academics. This is part of feedback.
Right, yes. Yeah, no, that's all very interesting. So have you got any sort of example, obviously sort of anonymous examples, but thinking of students who you've given feedback to, whose performance has really improved as a consequence of what you've given to them? I mean, you've won this award, so some students obviously felt that that you'd had made a big difference to them. What sort of situations might you be able to make a very big difference?
It's always hard to tell because I teach mainly 1st and 2nd year. I like teaching 1st and 2nd year, and so I don't always follow through the 3rd years. I did though get a card last year from a 3rd year, which rather surprised me. And it said, "Thank you very much for the well-deserved kick in the pants that you gave me in my 2nd year. I owe it all to you." You know, she'd ended up with a good degree and she was really pleased with it.
Oh, good.
So it can be done, but you never know what effect it's going to have. I mean, in my module, the module I've just taught, the marks did go up 3 points between the 1st and the 2nd essay, but that was only on average. Sometimes if people are getting rid of old habits, it can be painful and it can be difficult. They don't quite know what they're doing when they're starting. They can go back as well as forward.
Right, yes.
So you can't ever guarantee instant results. Sometimes you'll only see the results years later.
Yes, and you talk about them getting rid of old habits. Are they particularly habits you've seen sort of maybe changing in recent years? Is anything that over the course of your career, how do you think students have changed in their relationship with feedback and?
I think probably they take it more seriously. I came into the job in 1969, which in a way was an absolute high for stroppy students who didn't know a lot of work. And what's happened ever since then, strangely enough, I'm not saying, you know, oh, students these days don't do a stroke. They have on balance started working harder, they get more anxious about playing safe. My biggest problem really academically is knocking out of them the bad habits that their sixth form teachers have given them. Writing in a very formal academic style that isn't their own voice, depending too much on secondary works, instead of thinking about the text for themselves, sometimes when they're perfectly capable of thinking about the text for themselves. So it's knocking that kind of thing out. But of course, if they have to look at the text for themselves the very first time, that's going to be alarming. They're going to make mistakes before they stabilise. So you can't guarantee that good feedback will necessarily produce immediate good results. These things need to develop through trial and error. And people are frightened of error. They're frightened of trial these days. Just as academics are playing safe in their research, students are playing safe in their essays. And I see it as my job to encourage them to take risks. But then marks can go up as well as go down. So, I must be aware of this.
So if a student takes a risk, then there's always a possibility they'll do something extremely brilliant and.
They may do something absolutely brilliant. They may do something which is absolutely rubbish and go completely off on the wrong tack. And they have to be tough enough to cope with that. That's where the independence comes in. I would like to encourage my students to cope with setbacks. I went sulk for a year because I got a harsh reader's report. And then I realised there was a point to it. Right. And I addressed the problems, and the final book was much better for it. And I want to encourage my students to do that as well. I do not, I am very careful with my marking. I try to be positive in my comments, but I do not give my students an easy ride. And I think that's important as well.
So the sort of firm but fair approach is.
I try to.
is to use a cliche, is yes. Sort of what you're getting at.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. No. A lot of people have been talking about technology and feedback. We've been
yes.
thinking. We've had all sorts of suggestions put to us. Audio feedback on essays. Filling in, comments written directly onto the electronic version, and obviously submitting it through virtual learning environments and these sorts of things. Are these tools a help or a hindrance, do you think?
I suspect that for us they would be a hindrance because our student numbers are very high. We take in perhaps up to 250 first years a year. We have massive numbers. Writing comments on essays, even writing comments electronically on essays is too time consuming. Try correcting punctuation electronically rather than by just sort of writing in the commas.
Right, yes.
It takes time. And personally, I can't stand podcasts because you have to sit and listen to them. You can't skip through them. They're just annoying, and they demand technology. What I want is technology which makes things faster, makes things easier. Just because it's a bell and whistle doesn't make it good. Things like the student dashboard, things like e-assignments, are things which make our life better. I think that they're absolutely wonderful. The web has made our lives better. Having stuff online, things like Blackboard, they're just really, really helpful. But, just doing it for the sake of it in a tiny pilot, and of course the students love it. Students always love pilots because they're chosen students and the samples are very small and the tutor's enthusiastic. Try applying it to a class, a world-weary class of 160 students, some of whom don't want to be there, and it's not going to work as well.
Right.
But then I'm 67, I would say that, wouldn't I?
Well, I don't know.
But I have always been an early adopter of technology, to be fair. But, you learn if you're an early adopter that some things are really worth it. Things like eFolio I jump at. because without any effort on your part, they suddenly make your life easier, they make your teaching more effective. That's terrific. But, you know, it's like MOOCs. Fantastic. There's this course, you set it up to run and you walk away. Okay, who's going to update it next year? Who's going to monitor the students? Things like that.
So again, we're actually talking about individual relationships, really, is what it comes down to, even in these online situations, and that's, you know, what we need for good feedback is maintaining those relationships between students and staff.
Yes, and those individual relationships. At the heart of education, it always has been. You'll find that educational reformers, those who believe in, you know, all these methods of assessment which give the student greater independence and so on, one thing they'll often say, I'm sure you've come across it, is education is a drawing out, not a putting in.
Right, yes.
You've come across that, haven't you? Right. That is because they are bleeding ignorant, and they think that the word education comes from the Latin educere, which means to lead out or to draw out. It doesn't. If it did, it would be adduction, not education. It comes from another Latin verb, which is educare, which means to foster or to nurture.
Mm.
So all the reformers say, we don't want to spoon feed our students, all this constant contact is bad for them, it makes them dependent on the tutor. But education is about nurture, it's about fostering. Again, you know, it's a question of guiding people so they make good use of their independence. On average, humanities students across the country spend about half the hours on their degree that we expect them to spend. They spend too little time on private study. And if you leave them to their own devices, however efficient your assessment and feedback mechanisms, and I use the word mechanism advisedly, they'll get by all right, but they're not being pushed and they're not being challenged. What you need to do, well, for a start you need to load them with work,
right.
Which is always a problem,
You
isn't it?
You keep them busy,
walk,
yes.
Right. You keep them busy. Oxford always gets low satisfaction ratings on fairness of workload.
Right.
And absolutely right. You know, when I was at Oxford, they would say, right, off you go, read the Fairy Queen for next week, and you went off and you read the Fairy Queen for next week.
Mm.
And we are efficient, we teach things in bite-sized pieces, but we want to make demands on our students, we want to push them, we want to challenge them. Intellectual maturity isn't when you've been thrown in at the deep end of the swimming pool, it's when you finally pluck up the assurance to challenge your tutor. And that is what growth is. And you need to be pushed very hard to get that kind of growth. And that's where the personal relationship comes in. It can be an affectionate relationship. So I'm not talking about tutors drinking with their students or being their Facebook friends. In fact, I think this is probably a very bad thing. It's bringing them on. And I think that kind of encouragement is very important, and it is what students appreciate.
You talk a lot about sort of nurturing students. Do you think that's something that's become, that's changed over the course of your career? Do you think it was better or easier at the beginning of your career than it is now?
It's very hard to tell, really. It was different at the beginning of my career. We had very small classes, we had tutorials, we knew our students extremely well. There were a lot of friendships, social students and staff moved in the same social circle, young staff particularly, going to students' parties, things like that. There's a much closer relationship between staff and students. At the same time, there was a lot less efficiency, there was a lot less professionalism, I would say, than there is in the department now. When you're under pressure, the first thing you have to do is to become more efficient, to become more scrupulous. We have a very good relationship with our student representatives. We have a good relationship in English with our students generally. But it is also much harder to do this. You don't have the kind of intimacy that you had under the old system, and people really struggle to keep up that quality of personal interaction. So I wouldn't say that it was better or worse. We have gained in professionalism, we have lost some of the intimacy which was possible with a very much smaller student body. That's not going to come back.
No, and when did you think it really started to change, or at what point did you really think, oh, this is really...
It was the 80s. That was when we abandoned, that was when all the major university cuts came. And that's when universities across the country, on the whole, gave up tutorials, went over to seminars, streamlined their teaching very considerably. That was when our feedback abruptly got better. We introduced cover sheets on essays so people didn't get cursory feedback. Introduce a set time for the return of essays so people weren't kept hanging around. All these things made things better. Being professional, being efficient can compensate for the loss of slack in the system. But it means that we have to work much harder at maintaining the personal element.
Right, okay. And this is a final question, Bella. What advice would you give to somebody who's just coming in as a new member of academic staff who hadn't taught before, when you're thinking about relationships with students, with feedback? What advice would you be giving to them?
Well, the first thing, of course, would be to know your students. I would give them advice on how you memorise students' names. There are tricks that you can use to do that. On feedback, I would say, look, best practice is you get it back fast, it should be full, it should be courteous, even when you're giving negative comments, and I would very strongly recommend the mid-semester interview, but I do worry about how realistic this is for full-time members of staff. I have done this for years, but it's become harder and harder every year, and it's only been possible for me in the last few years, I think, because I'm semi-retired, I'm a part-timer, and that means if I run out of time I can steal some of my own time.
Right.
And I don't think that this should be necessary, because I think that this mid-semester session is the most important thing of all. It closes the feedback circle. Students, I mean, can I tell you about a problem I have with some of... now, a problem that we all have is, I said, English is very good about giving full feedback. We have cover sheets, we annotate our students' essays in some detail. And then what happens? Some of the students, they don't bother to collect the essay at all, they collect it and they don't look at the annotations, and you look back over their cover sheets and you've got the same comment on every flipping cover sheet.
Yes.
Get your referencing sorted out.
Right,
Things like that.
yes.
Now, the thing is though, recently I've been a student, I've been learning Japanese,
Oh, right.
and I've realised why they do this. I've got a very good tutor, she gives full feedback, she annotates my exercises. What do I do when I get my exercises back? First thing I look for is the mark. Second thing, I look and see if there are any kind words. Third thing, am I going to look at her comments? I don't want to look at her comments. I don't want to know how I went wrong. It's just depressing. I have to force myself to look at her comments. And that's how the students feel. And that's why you need to close the quality circle. You have the interview, the student brings their written work, you go through it, you talk to them about it. You discuss how they can move forward. You say, look, this must be fixed. And it works.
So I think there's something to say. It's you know, that everybody should be a student at the same time as being a teacher.
I'm a typical
student
bad student of Japanese. I understand my students much better because I'm a student. You're right.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Bella. It was a really interesting interview. So
Thank you.
very
It's been a
much
pleasure.
for sharing that with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.